Welcome to the Banana Republican podcast. I'm James Gorey. Trump's tariffs kick in today. So, what's that looking like, and what's that going to look like going forward? Well, first of all, it's going to affect dozens of countries. Our top trading partners, obviously. If you've been paying attention at all, you know that the European Union has agreed to some tariffs, South Korea and Japan. They all face kind of a new base rate of 15%. And there's also reciprocal tariffs coming into force, where if a country or a trading partner is charging us X, then we'll charge them the same amount, just even Steven, as it were, right? So that means importers will be paying somewhere between 10% and 50% in the coming months as these uh, reciprocal tariffs kick in. Now let's go kind of country by country. We talked about the EU, but it's basically there's a pretty much 15% across the board there, and there's some other things going on. But Brazil, for example, and I'm going to do this for a reason, you'll see in a moment. Brazil saw 50% tariffs go into effect yesterday, and trade with the U.S. is about 36% of their revenue. So that's a big chunk. That's a big deal. And you'd say, well, Brazil, why is Brazil important? It is for a number of reasons, which we'll go into. Another one is India. Now, India faces 25% tariffs, and the U.S. is 20% of their exports. So, according to the IMF, so that's a big hit for them. But there's more. They could see their rates double within a matter of weeks. That's because India is buying quite a bit of Russian oil, which Trump doesn't want to happen. Russia's the world's, I think, third largest oil producer behind Saudi Arabia and the US, but they're funding their Ukraine war with oil and gas revenues. Even though this year shipments have been falling, according to Bloomberg. And, you know, the tariffs against Russia really aren't going to have that much effect because we're only like 3 or 4% of trade with Russia. We buy vodka and probably oils and minerals and things like that. But I don't think it's really a huge. Well, it's not. It's not a huge factor. But the sanctions will be. But tariffs today won't be. But India. The whole point with India is the tariffs are going to be applied to people, nations who purchase Russian oil. So the goal of taxing or tariff India is to minimize the flow of Russian oil gas revenues to Russia, which means minimizing sales to the global market. That makes it harder for Russia to fund the war. And needless to say, I'll say it anyway, oil and gas are Russia's biggest export. And their biggest customers are China, India, and Turkey. And so some secondary tariffs will take place in a few weeks, probably 2 or 3 weeks, I think it is. I think it's 3 weeks. So what's more, U.S. companies that are buying goods from India, while India is buying oil from Russia, will have to pay 100% import tax. So that's to incentivize U.S. importers from not importing from India, importing somewhere else, thereby depriving India of revenues, thereby punishing them for purchasing Russian oil. And it's about 1/3 of Russia's revenues is through oil and gas. So that's a big deal. So there's a tremendous amount of focus on these tariffs, secondarily around targeting Russia's oil revenues through its partners, particularly India. Now, it's one thing that's also interesting to note is that Trump, I think it's late last night, Wednesday night, was talking about imposing a 100% tariff on all chips and semiconductors coming into the U.S. Now, there's a loophole, or there's an out, as Trump usually gives people an out. That's what he does. It's negotiation, right? So he does offer them an exemption or a workaround, whatever you want to call it, if said producing nation for chips and semiconductors offers a commitment to build a factory inside the U.S., which is interesting, right? I mean, let's face it. Do you want to pay a lot of money to import it, or do you want to have a factory just right here in the U.S. and not pay any? So there's a method to his madness. It's pretty smart. Now, according to different calculations, I mean, they're all over the map, and kind of who's going to react heavily, who's going to be hurt, who's going to be less hurt, or make some accommodations with the Trump administration to reduce the tariff. So whatever the tariff average calculation is, it might be close. I doubt if it's totally accurate, but the Yale Budget Lab has come out with 18.3%, 0.3 of the average tariff effective rate. So that's still a lot of money. That's still a lot of impact on the economy. So it's not insignificant whatsoever. The big question is, will the tariffs work? I mean, what's going to happen? How are people going to react? How are countries going to react? In lots of ways, some predictable, some less predictable. So I would say to a degree, yes, they'll work, but we have to define working too, right? Are they going to drive inflation in the U.S.? Where's the money going to go, that the tariff money is going to go? Will it be enough to offset other things, other policies that are costing money, or cutting income, cutting revenues? So we'll see. There are certain price buffers. So, in other words, people say, well, tariffs lead to higher prices, and they do, unless there are substitutes. And so for the world's oil prices on the market, the global market, OPEC, they have significant excess capacity. They can and their allies, the OPEC plus they're called, I think. So oil producing and exporting countries. So OPEC and its allies, they could make up for a lot of the shortfall if Russian gas gets too expensive with tariffs, secondary tariffs to the U.S., whatever, as I talked about with India. So they can keep prices low. And so that's also, it would help trading partners avoid the secondary tariffs. So if India says, oh, we can buy gas and oil from Saudi Arabia or the U.S., then we don't face these huge tariffs in the U.S. for buying Russian oil. So that's the incentivization, right? But there's also kind of other workarounds. Russia's got what's called a shadow fleet. Very similar to what China was doing and has been doing. It's gray trade, right? To avoid tariffs. And that is tons of oil tankers, maybe false flagged, or we don't know where they're from. They're not from Russia. And so they're exporting Russian oil and gas that way and selling it to other tankers and other, transferring to other ships and what have you. So a lot of kind of cloak and dagger stuff to avoid the sanctions. But, there's a key point to understand here. And it's this. Maintaining sanctions or enforcing them are a lot more difficult than imposing them. Imposing them is a stroke of a pen, right? Pretty much, in Trump's case. But maintaining them, working through and keeping track of who's doing what and who's cheating and who's double dealing and who's concealing the sources of their products, that's harder. And listen, China's buying most of the Russian oil by far, and the reality is that's not going to change. Russia and China have this agreement, and that would be a huge blow to that alliance if China stopped buying Russian oil. I don't think it's going to happen. But it's also problematic because the U.S. has to be careful on how much pressure it puts on China, because our imports from China are 5 times greater than they are from India. And they're consumer goods, so they're going to hit consumers in the pocketbook. So there's a political calculus there, right? Secondary tariffs on China also risk kind of the broader trade negotiations that are underway between Washington and Beijing. So there's overlapping impacts and ripple effects and so forth that are somewhat predictable, but are somewhat unpredictable as well. In other words, we don't know to what degree, and we'll just have to see. So tariffs are harder to maintain and enforce and moderate or monitor rather than they are simply to, oh, we're going to put a tariff on you. So there's a lot more to it. The devil's in the details, as they say, right? So we've looked at tariffs aimed specifically at Brazil, Russia, indirectly at Russia, India, and China. I mean, China's tariffs are going to be huge in some areas, and we're still working that out. But what about South Africa? Why would there be tariffs against South Africa? There's a good reason for that, and I'll hit that at the end here if you haven't already guessed. But South Africa will be hit by the highest tariffs in sub-Saharan Africa, 30%. That's twice as high as any other nation in the sub-Saharan region of Africa. What's more, the U.S. is their second largest trading partner, so that's a big deal to South Africa. It's a big problem. And here's the thing. South Africa had a very good deal with the U.S. There's something called the African Growth and Opportunities Act, AGOA, A-G-O-A. An act like 25 years ago, back in 2000. And it was designed to help create jobs, stimulate the economy. South Africa's automobile industry and their farming and their textile sectors, they all had free access to the U.S. market. Okay, no tariffs, no sanctions, nothing. That's over now. So you have to ask yourself, I mean, why are we hitting South Africa with 30% tariffs, higher than any other nation? Notably, exports from Algeria and Libya will also be at that 30% tariff rate, payable at the U.S. border. Tunisian goods are facing 25% rate. However, Kenya and Ethiopia will be charged just a 10% rate. So there's definitely some differentiation here. And South Africa is being hit so hard for a very specific reason. Now, some personal context here. Having read The Art of the Deal a few years back, many years ago actually, but more importantly, I've had extensive discussions with Trump's former executive VP, George Ross, at the Trump Organization. And we talked about a lot of things. Very interesting guy, very smart guy. And what he said to me on various occasions, we weren't talking about Trump, but we were talking about real estate investing and the market and all kinds of things. But one thing he said that I remember really clearly is that Trump is always about linkage, multi-level impacts, extended advantages. So a deal, there's not just a one-dimensional deal. Hey, I give you A, you get B, and then here's the price, and we're good. That's very transactional. And Trump is much more about a multi-level, multi-dimensional, multi-impact thinker. That's who he is. And you can say he's got a lot of flaws, and he certainly does. Don't we all? But I thought I was thinking about it. I remember those conversations with George, and he said, look, he says, this is who he is, so there's much more to the deal than the deal, okay, than the initial deal up front. So bearing that in mind, I'm looking at Trump's tariffs, and I think there are means to several ends, and some are obvious, and some are less obvious, or maybe just not as clear-cut, but I think they're there. Number one, and there's not in any particular order, we want to raise, obviously, investment in the U.S. He's making that a quid pro quo. Hey, you invest, you don't pay the tariffs. So getting U.S., the manufacturing base, revitalized is a top priority. So is protecting existing U.S. manufacturers. So is creating jobs. So those are three right there: raising investment, protecting U.S. manufacturers, raising jobs. Obviously, the investment brings in huge levels of the tariffs, rather bring huge levels of revenue. That's happening today. So that's a fourth thing. There's also help paying for tax cuts and some other policy, like capital gains tax, other policy things that we know we're going to have a shortfall or there's going to be less revenue coming in. hopefully the tariffs, as he said often, there was a time 100 years ago or so that tariffs were the main source of federal revenue. So there's that angle as well. Help justify, help cover, help pay for the tax cuts. Obviously, the growth, economic growth, will help with the tax base as well. And then he wants to work in tandem with ending foreign labor preferences. So along with not doing business, not letting foreign businesses just eat our lunch here, he's saying, look, we're going to get rid of cheap labor out of the South, out of Latin America and other places, and we're just going to stop replacing American workers with foreign workers at the technical level, technological, at the higher level. So that's another thing that happens, that he wants to be a help. That's kind of an extended impact, but the idea is Trump wants to have a total picture, a whole picture policy, not just transactional on goods coming in. And of course, as mentioned, he wants to help defund Russia's war budget with Ukraine. He's looking at it as an angle of, if we starve them of revenue, they're going to have a tougher time waging war, which makes a lot of sense. Again, there's another one, and it's kind of related to that, is he wants to punish nations that are against us. So South Africa is doing things that the Trump administration doesn't like, particularly Donald Trump doesn't like. I mean, you saw that meeting he had with the South African president, or prime minister, or premier, whatever his title is, and he showed that horrible video of a political leader talking about killing white farmers, essentially. I think it was kill the boer, and Trump confronted him with it. So I thought at the time, and I think I wasn't the only person to think that, is like, what's he doing with the South African president in the Oval Office just a month or 2 or 3 months into his second term, rather? What's he doing there? Why is he important? So that's a question I asked, kind of just to myself, really. But I think these specific tariffs at Brazil, at Russia, at India, China to come, and South Africa, again, as I mentioned in my previous podcast, I think a big part of this is Trump is waging war against the BRICS de-dollarization plan. And so these tariffs, yes, they're doing all we talked about in terms of raising revenue, protecting manufacturers, and bringing investment dollars into the country, reinvigorating the manufacturing base. But it's also it's a targeted policy, a comprehensive policy to undercut the BRICS de-dollarization program, which is going full speed ahead, and which is targeting the American-led global financial system. And BRICS is nothing less than a threat against the entire world in terms of how the world works. And it's a bunch of, as I mentioned yesterday, or I think it was yesterday, the BRICS is a segue, is an entree, is one of the legs of a new world order. And that world order doesn't include the U.S. and the U.S. dollar running global trade. So I think from a broader context, a bigger picture, there is a specific target other than the obvious ones. I think BRICS is really the top target for Trump's tariffs. I could be wrong, but let me know what you think. I'm James Gorey. Hey, give us a subscribe or a comment or a like or a share and help support the channel. See you next time.